Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. This is the sixth encounter, the sixth event of our GEELLE, Grupo de Estudos sobre Educação Linguística em Línguas Estrangeiras. And so today we have the pleasure and the honor to welcome Professor Dr. Jan Masschelein and Dr. Limario Menezes de Souza. And as usual, I am going to do that very, very brief introduction, okay? So I'm going to share with you my screen. And this is basically for those who are here with us for the first time, and for those who don't know our project. So, as I told you, this is a GEELLE, Grupo de Estudos sobre Educação Linguística em Línguas Estrangeiras, in English, study group or research group on language education in foreign languages. And today, as I told you, we have talking to us Professor Dr. Jan Masschelein and Dr. Limario Menezes de Souza. So Professor Masschelein will talk about youngsters longing for school in COVID times, and an unexpected appeal for reinventing school. And Limario Menezes de Souza will be talking about teachers as invisible victims in COVID times. So we thought about like a main theme, educating in COVID times. And Ana Paula and I will be moderating the talk, okay? I'm very happy. I think this is a very special live, not only because of the themes, educating in COVID times, and I have this impression by talking to colleagues from all over Brazil that it has been a struggle, it has been a challenge to deal with everything that we've been through, like in teacher education. And with the pandemic in Brazil, things have gotten even worse. But for me personally, I'm having a chance to talk to Ana Paula and I, to talk to two very experienced and important researchers and professors in the field of education and language education from Belgium and from Brazil. But also, personally, I'm also having a chance to dialogue with my two supervisors of postdoctoral studies. So Lynn was my supervisor between 2014 and 2016. In a postdoctoral research, I carried on language teacher education and gender and sexuality studies. And now, Jan is my postdoctorate supervisor here in Belgium, in which I've been researching and studying teacher education and philosophy of education. So by saying this, I'd like to thank both Jan and Lynn for being here with us, and I think it's going to be a wonderful and insightful afternoon in Brazil and evening here in Belgium. So this is our email, geelleusp@gmail.com. And I'd like you, our group, our research group, is also connected to the National Project of Literacies, Language, Culture, Education, and Technology. So this is the website if you want to get to know more. It is basically a national project with 35 universities by now, if I'm not mistaken. So 35 universities from all over Brazil and scholars getting together to discuss teacher education, literacies, language, culture, and technology. So this was our first event this year. We had Dr. Matos, Eluf, and Dr. Martinez talking about teacher education in times of pandemic. And this was in Portuguese. And we also had Robert Mitzi and Joe Window talking about, and myself, talking about queer theory education and language education in Canadian and Brazilian contexts. I'm also showing all this because I'd like to ask you to help us spread the news. Everything is recorded on YouTube, the YouTube channel GEELLE, Daniel Ferraz. This one was about internationalization and teacher education, research projects and pedagogical practices in the fields of German, French, and English with Doctors Uphoff, Albuquerque Costa, and Fonseca. And this was in April, the first encounter of April, and we had dialogues on teacher education, the contributions of the Spanish area, okay, with Professors Van Hoel, Gregolin, and Batista. The last event, the last talk, we had Ana Paula Duboc and Gabriela Veronelli, and we talked about decoloniality and language education, okay? So we will be very happy if you could help us spread the news about these events, because as they are all recorded, whenever you have time, you can go to our channel and watch them. Just remind you that one event is in Portuguese and the other is in English, one in Portuguese and the other is in English. So it's very important to mention that as today's event is going to be in English. And of course, English is the common language for our communication, okay? So I'm doing this very, very brief introduction. And then part one today, we will have Dr. Masschelein and Dr. Menezes de Souza presenting their talks. They have about 30 minutes each, okay? And of course, I'd like to invite you to join us in the chat, the YouTube chat, by making comments and asking questions, because Michelle and Gabriela, they're helping us here in the backstage, and they're going to project your comments whenever they can. And also the questions, we will select all the questions, perhaps put some questions together if they're similar, but we will try to ask most of the questions for Jan and Lynn to chat. So the second part, the last part today, will be the questions from the YouTube chat, and then we will invite Jan and Lynn to come back to screen and for them to chat between themselves and based on the questions, okay? So the moderators today are Ana Paula and I, and I think we can move on to the first part already, okay? I will stop the presentation, Michelle, thank you. And I think we can invite Professor Masschelein, Michelle, back to the screen. Thank you. And I will first read, before I thank Jan for being here with our Brazilian students and researchers, I will just read, of course, a summary of his resume, because he's very well known, especially in the Faculty of Education at the University of São Paulo and many areas in education in Brazil, but perhaps not in language education. This is something nice for us to get to know Professor Maschelein's work. So Jan Masschelein is a full professor at the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences, a staff member to the Laboratory of Education and Society at the Catholic University of Leuven. He studied educational sciences and philosophy at Catholic University of Leuven and at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe Universität in Frankfurt, and is a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung. Masschelein, you correct me. Sorry for some of my pronunciation. So his primary areas of scholarship are educational philosophy and theory, critical and social theory. And so his current research nowadays concentrates on the defense of the public role and the character of schools and universities, on the design of learning cities, on a contemporary pedagogical approach towards emancipation and work, and on mapping and walking as research practices. Dr. Masschelein has been engaged with architects and artists in the development of experimental educational practices in the elaboration of collective experiments with students. I think his most famous book in Brazil is a co-written book he co-wrote with Simons, In Defense of School. And this is very well known, I know, all over the country. And he has also published a number of very interesting articles and other books, and most of them are available online. And let me just tell you, if you would like to read more about Professor Maschelein's work, and if you registered in our event, we can send you later on some of his texts together with the certificates. Okay, after this very formal presentation, Jan, thank you very much for being with us. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have you here talking to our students. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for your invitation, for your kind words as introduction. Of course, it's a pity not to be in São Paulo now at this moment, in some sense. And before I start, maybe I should say that although maybe more now than ever, there is a kind of global condition in the sense that we share the pandemic conditions everywhere. On the other hand, I think that the situation in Brazil is also particular. And that in that sense, it differs also very strongly from the situation in Leuven, in Belgium, where I am now. But I hope that what I say and which is related, or what I will say, which is related to the pandemic to some extent, can also speak to you. And maybe I should also say that I apologize if I am going to repeat too much of another talk, because I have been talking in another occasion a few months ago, also in Sao Paulo, well, in Leuven, but in Sao Paulo, and so some of the things could come back. I think some things will be also different. So first of all, thank you for inviting me for this presentation and to offer me the opportunity to present some reflections on school and maybe also on the future of school. And I want to emphasize also that in a certain sense, it's not only my personal reflections that I present to you, because as some of you might know, my work is very strongly based on my cooperation with or collaboration with Maarten Simons. And so, as Daniel already said, we have published together In Defense of the School, translated also in Portuguese. Now, when we first published the book in Dutch in 2012, almost 10 years ago, it might have seemed somewhat odd to want to defend the school. But today, things have changed. Not only parents and policymakers seem to have rediscovered the importance of school, mainly probably for economic reasons, at least in our context here in Belgium. So parents want their children to go to school because it is very difficult to work at home when the children are at home. And policymakers want children to go to school because they consider it also as a kind of investment in human capital. But what for critics of school education, equating it often with an inefficient, outdated, and boring form of learning. So what for these critics was unimaginable in certain extent actually occurred. Also, a lot of children and youngsters stated that they are longing for school. So this appeal is unexpected, and some might say that they just want to see their friends, or that it is just a nostalgia to a school that never existed, and thereby, or that they are overlooking the many bad experiences that are for sure also related to school. Our hypothesis, however, is that these youngsters are pointing to something existential about school, where education for education which cannot simply be replaced by digital learning environments and social networks. So what they miss, we believe, is a particular experience of freedom, of equality and world, a particular experience of world, which is offered by school when school actually happens. And of course, it often does not happen. And what we call school is often also not really a school. So, but what school offers when it happens? From a pedagogical point of view, school is not an institution or a building, but a gathering that makes something happen. And so I would like to clarify what this happening is about, not only to understand what students are missing or saying that they are missing, but also to be able to start to maybe address the issue of education in post-COVID times. In fact, I doubt whether we are already capable of imagining the new normal that hopefully will arrive, but it will be for sure not simply returning to the old normal, and it will be also for sure education with the digital. But in order to really engage in this imagining, it might be useful to offer some elements of what one could call a kind of pedagogical compass to orient that thinking about the future of education. And so, therefore, I would like to clarify what the school is doing. So school as a pedagogic form, so not as an institutional form, but as a pedagogic form, can be conceived as a particular, artificially, that means technologically and pedagogically composed gathering and arrangement of people, time, space, and matter that constitutes a milieu, a middle, where people, young people, are brought in each other's company and in company of something of the world in a particular way, so that this world opens up and that one can start to belong to that world. So this particular gathering and arrangement suspends, that means puts temporarily out of effect. So it's not about destroying or denying, but puts temporarily out of effect the ties of family and state. So when entering school, everyone becomes student or pupil like anyone else and is no longer son or daughter, no son or daughter of the family in the small sense, but also not son or daughter of the state, or the nation, the family as a nation. So bringing children to school is the visible mark of the acknowledgement that our children are not our children. We neither own them, nor do we own their future. It is important here to emphasize that school is an embodied performativity that is addressing everyone as just one, so not as a son or a daughter, but as just one, everyone as a pupil or a student, which is, however, not about recognizing each person as having its own or proper abilities and talents, and I will come back to that. It is about refusing any natural or pre-given connection between bodies' minds, on the one hand, and their proper characteristics or the capacities ascribed or attributed to them. So school enables a particular form of learning. So there are many forms of learning, and scholastic learning is just one form, a particular form of learning that materializes the belief that human beings have no natural destination and offers the experience of being able to shape, to give shape, to find one's own destination or form, which is not about choosing it, as I will try to clarify also. So school is a pedagogic form, is a gathering that is generating what you could call free time through all kinds of practices, technology, including, of course, crucially also the role of teachers. And I will give later on some very concrete examples of how this free time is generated. So the first meaning of the Greek skole, which is the origin of the term school in many, many languages, is indeed not referring to learning, but to a particular kind of time. That's the first reference. It is free time, which is the time which is separated from the time of production and the time of a defined occupation. It is so separated from the time both of the household and society. It is, you could say, time for study and exercise as the time for the new generation to become fit to take care of a common world and to find and form one's own destination, which is not the one defined, projected, or dreamt by the older generation. One could call this pedagogical freedom. So pedagogical freedom. So I'm not talking about political freedom or another kind of juridical freedom, but pedagogical freedom. School as a pedagogic form, and so different maybe from school as an institution, school as a pedagogic form is neither oriented towards a political utopia or a normative ideal of a person, but is in itself the materialization of a utopian belief. Yes, so the utopia is not at the end of the school, but at the start. It starts from an utopian belief, maybe something that you could call with John Dewey, kind of pedagogical creed, a kind of starting belief, which you could formulate as everybody can learn everything. Yes. Meaning that neither what you can learn nor what you have to learn are naturally predefined. We don't know what a body or a mind are capable of. So hence, it is not predefined what you can learn or what one can learn, and it is also not naturally predefined what you have to learn. So, and there is also, in that sense, the element that there is no predefined connection between a body of mind, its abilities, and the social positions that are taken up. In that sense, school and organizing school reminds us that our form of life could have been completely different. That there is an element of radical contingency. And in that sense, so since who we are is also part or the effect or the result of learning, so and not only naturally predefined, it means that organizing school is always a polemical intervention that creates all kinds of counter reactions where people try to search for necessities. So to say that it is that, for example, to make differences between students based on saying they have certain natural talents and hence they have to be treated differently. So precisely this kind of connection is what the school is always putting into question, you could say. Now, school is creating this free time, this separated this time of study and exercise through a particular practice of sharing. And we like to formulate this sharing as a kind of, or to try to formulate the sharing in terms of putting the world on the table. We like very much this image, huh? And it is not only an image, but this idea of putting something on the table. So let me take the example of an engine that is taken out of a car and put on a table, not just to repair it, but to be able to study it and the way it operates, to disclose and meet the world of mechanics. If the engine is put on a table in a garage, the engine must go as quick as possibly back into the car in order to perform its usual function, to please the customers and make money for the owner of the garage. But in school, you have no boss, you have a teacher, and you don't have the claims of the economy, at least not in a direct way. These claims being temporarily suspended allows you to have the time to study and exercise your eyes and your hands in dealing with the engine. More generally, we could say that in school, worlds are put on the table in an undefined, a grammatized, and an inviting form. That something is put on the table in an undefined or inoperative form means that something is taken out of its usual context and use. For example, the economic context in which you want to have a return. That it is put on the table in a grammatized form means that it is offered in its fundamental elements and principles of working. For example, the grammar of the world of mechanics, and of course also the grammar of the world of language. That it is put on the table in an inviting form means that it supports students to pay attention, that they are seduced to an encounter with something of the world that could actually infect them with a certain passion for that world, where in a certain sense that world could start to speak to students. Where the engine could start to speak, that means also to have some authority. Where the direction of our relation would change. Because when the engine starts to speak, then it is not just I who decides in sovereignty what to do with it. But the engine also requires some attention and care from our side. It requires a response, hence responsibility, an ability to respond to it. I start to belong to the world of mechanics, but also start to feel obliged by it, obliged to become fit to take care of it. So it can make me belong to a world outside my known world or my life world. It can enable a certain freedom from social forces. Not only classmates or friends or teachers oblige us, but also the engine can start to speak, can require a response, and hence open up a common world beyond the purely social world. And I think that is a very important point, and let me return in this context to precisely to today and what I said about the fact that how to understand the fact that young people want school or longing for school. So I think that what they miss, I think, at school, one of the elements that they miss, I think, is precisely an experience of what it means to have school. What it means to have a world, or opposite, that they have experienced what it means to have no world. So that they have experienced what it means to have a social life, a life which is limited to communication and exchange, a life that is an environment, a life in an environment that can facilitate or threaten life, that can be friendly or hostile. But what they miss, I think, is a world which allows them also to be liberated from what I would like to call, and it's a reference to Hannah Arendt in a certain sense, the terror of the social, the terror of the social. So it is a world beyond the social. So, which means, in fact, that what they miss, but I will come back to that. And so what they miss is, I think, a certain liberation from their family and a certain liberation also from their friends. So from the social, from a purely social life. I will come back to that. So the free time of the school is not the time of entertainment. It is also not the time of development or maturation, but it is the time of work. It is the time of exercise and study. That means the time of a physical and mental effort, of the pain that can go with that effort, but which is not the pain related to a lack of recognition, which is the pain related to the social world, that we are not recognized by the other. But so it is another kind of pain that goes with the physical and the mental effort, but there is, of course, also the work and exercise goes together with the joy. For example, the joy of the first step. And because it is the time of exercise and study, of trying and experimenting, it is not the time of a performance on a stage, but it requires a certain invisibility, not the performance on a stage. It is not productive time, but free time, and precisely therefore, it is also a special time of transmission of knowledge and skills. It is not transmission as a pure function of reproduction and hence of socialization, which is under the sign of acceleration and tries to avoid every friction and interruption. So the idea that the transmission should be as fast, efficient, and effective as possible. So school is questioning this idea of transmission as a transmission without friction, as a pure function of reproduction, which has to be fast, efficient, and effective. The free time of school is the time which at once slows down and intensifies the transmission. Because what is transmitted is not directly transmitted from my hands to your hands or from my head to your head, but is precisely put on the table for study and exercise. So it is made public in a certain way. And from a pedagogical point of view, it is precisely this interruption and not the kind of direct transmission which makes that a new generation can appear, which maybe also can question what is offered on the table. There can be a kind of experience of a beginning, so not just of a reproducing, of being able to begin, for example, with the world of mechanics. It means also that things could be questioned and renewed, not just reproduced or continued. Summarizing it again in words of Hannah Arendt, who translates the Greek skole into free time as the time in which we are free for the world. We are free for the world. Now, in order to further clarify what school does, how it generates this free time, and it's just one element that I will take out of it, because of many things, how school tries to create this free time or contributes to creating this free time. So let me refer, and since I am in a faculty that is dealing with language, I think it is maybe interesting precisely to talk about the language and to talk about the pedagogical art of speech. Yes, what I would call the pedagogical art of speech, I would say, is a fabulous art of speech. And it is a fabulous art of speech. That means that it is not, that the pedagogical art of speech is not a moral one nor a political one. Yes, that it is fabulous, and it refers to the notion of the fable. Yes, that it is fabulous means that it is offering the world, disclosing the world, or tries to speak in such a way that the world starts to speak, that the animals start to speak, that the numbers start to speak, that the stones start to speak. So it is fabulous in that sense that it makes the world speak, and that it offers it in such a way that it at once offers the possibility and confirms the possibility of the ones to whom one is speaking, that they are able to make their own interpretation of what is said. Yes. So in that sense, it is fabulous. And it is interesting to mention in this context, which has been mentioned by many other people also, or observed by many other people also, is that a fable in itself has no lesson. It is precisely because it has no lesson that it is stating that you can find out your own lesson. And it is precisely because that is risky that many times moral lessons are added to the fable. At the end, there is a moral lesson which is added to the fable, precisely to be sure that you don't interpret it in the way that you also could interpret it. But pedagogical art of speech is not a moral art. The pedagogical art of speech is not to teach you a lesson, but to confirm your ability to look and think for yourself. But at the same time, disclosing a world, make a world speak. That's for me a very important element of pedagogical art of speech, that it is fabulous in that sense, that it tries to be fabulous in that sense, so that it is not teaching lessons, but trying to disclose world and give the world a voice, to let it speak. But there is another element that I would like to point at, which is related to the pedagogical art of speech, which I think is this art that contributes to enabling you to find your own way, to go your own way also. And in order to clarify that, I would like to refer to one of the sentences that teachers often pronounce at school, and which is maybe characterizing by excellence the scholastic art of speech. And these are the utterings: try, just try, just try you too, and try this. So these are very banal sentences, very banal sentences. But to clarify how they actually, when they are actually pronounced in a concrete context, and when they are truly pronounced in a concrete context, they generate a transformation in the time, the space, and the matter. And in order to clarify that a little bit, I would like to refer to a comparison, to make a comparison which is based on the work of Bruno Latour, who refers to the also a banal phrase. Yes, I love you. Yes, very banal phrase. But Latour points to the fact that when in a real situation you truly say I love you, you change the situation. It's not a very original sentence. It's a very banal sentence. But if you actually say it to somebody in a concrete situation, you change the time and the space, and you change the matter. If I say I love you truly to you, I change the space because I'm saying maybe I was a bit far away, but now I'm near to you. I love you. And I also change the time because when I say it, it offers the possibility of a new time to begin, the time of our love, which will change, which will which offer us a different future, but at the same time also makes us look in a different way on our past. So this is just an example, to say that uttering some particular kinds of banal phrases can, when they really do it in a certain context, they change time, space, and matter. And so in the same way, I think you can think about this very banal sentence, try. Try creates an experience of freedom, of equality, and it creates also the experience of the existence of a common world. So maybe one could say that try is the expression of a double love of the teacher. A love for the student, and and this double love is also again referring to Hannah Arendt. It's a love of the teacher for the student and the love of the teacher for the world. If you say try, just try, maybe many students will say, this is not for me. This is something that I can't do or like to do. Or this is not for our kind of people. This kind of music is not something for me, and so on. This is also what certain sociologists will say, that for such and such kind of people, this kind of knowledge is not useful. They don't have to try. Also, there might be psychologists who will say that this kind of brain, this kind of mind will not be able to do this or that. But when the teachers say, just try, they are saying, this can all be true, but nevertheless, just try. They materialize the belief, yes, that we don't know, as I said, what a body and a mind is able of. We don't know. That is what you express when you say, just try, just try. You assume that the student, the pupil, has the freedom, and this is pedagogical freedom, the possibility, the ability to do something that everyone is saying that he or she is not able to. Even he himself is saying that I am not able to. If you say try, you are interrupting the usual time. It is no longer linear time where the past is saying and defining that you are not able or that you don't even have to try. So it allows for an experience of freedom towards the forces of the past. Try is changing also the space because it is confirming that you are in a safe space. So try. We will see what comes out, but you can safely try. The consequences are only pedagogical, not social or economic. The only consequences may be that if it doesn't work, the teacher will say, try again, try a third time, try a fourth time, try again. Try again means not only that a kind of freedom, but also a kind of equality in the sense of it is also for you. Also you, try again. But teacher also say, try this, meaning it is not just about you. It is not just about the person or the student. It is not just about what you want or what you think you want, but it is also about this, because this, what is on the table, is also important and interesting. So also try this. If you don't try it, you will not have the possibility to get out of your life world and the content contains. So this try is related to the presenting world, and presenting the world to students. When truly said, it is inviting and not imposing expectations, making something speak without silencing students, giving words and naming worlds without imposing closed definitions. It makes something present as a shared reality and give it some authority, saying that there is a common world in which you are invited and to which you can belong. So in that sense, it is opening a future for the individual as well for society. So to summarize, and I see that I hope it's no problem, Daniel. I'm a little bit slower than I thought. I have I will need 5 minutes more.
That's great. That's great, Ian. And it's nice because for people to follow and to understand. So it's been really, really okay. Yeah.
Okay. So I summarize. So school spreads the message that who you are is not just a product of social, physical, historical forces or of the context, but also the contingent result of learning, of study and exercise as a practice of encounter and infection. So that means as an undefined work of freedom, which in a certain sense is a quote of Michel Foucault. So schools materialize the belief that human beings have no natural, prescribed and predefined destination or form, and hence makes youngsters able to give shape and direction to this freedom by disclosing world in a particular way, while offering a certain protection against the social forces that entail socialization instead of education, and against the economic forces that enhance marketization and capitalization. I come back to that in a minute. So today, and especially in response to the corona crisis, we see a massive use of PCs, iPhones, online platforms, etc. So in fact, the pandemic has offered teachers a certain freedom from existing practices to experiment with new ways of sharing and interacting with their students through digital means. And I think we have to admire the devotion and creativity of teachers in their attempts to make school and to address their students through these digital means, which offer great possibilities and many more to be discovered. And for sure, as a very recent UNESCO report on education in post-COVID world rightly states, we have to be concerned about the access to these means and work to make them available to all. However, there are also other things to be concerned about in relation to the way in which the digital actually transforms the world of education. First of all, the increase of distance education makes that it now invades the home and seems to imply the loss of a milieu in which youngsters can leave behind their family context, at least for some time, to be students like all others. Hence, their social background and context risks to become much more determining for their future. Furthermore, it seems to strengthen the tendency to shape the spaces of education as learning environments that facilitate efficient, effective learning as the production of predefined outcomes and accelerated transmission, which is transforming, in fact, the free time, the slowed down time of school into production time, and might reinforce the reduction of education to programmed and personalized instruction, to feedback-driven task execution. Education also not conceived as care for a common world, but as a tailor-made, customized service. We also think that we have to be concerned about the creeping privatization of education, and I assume this is maybe different also in Brazil than it is here, about the exposure of students to the mining and the exploitation of the data they produce while moving through the online world, about the attempts to capitalize their attention, hence exposing them directly to economic forces of markets and to the social forces of social media, of media, that make them comply to social norms, becoming dependent on feedback and likes, hence strengthening socialization instead of education. So concerned about the way in which most of the digital platforms and the implied programs and devices confirm students mainly in an understanding of themselves as isolated customers with their needs and their preferences, customers of a tailored service defined by their characteristics. And we should not forget that this tailoring of education is more and more accompanied by a permanent tracking and monitoring of what students do, choose, perform, resulting in their personal profile. Profiling is at once an instrument and an effect. Just as a tracing of our activities on Amazon allows to make us more and more precise offer, one that fits our profile, so the permanent analysis of students' activities on learning platforms, the so-called learning analytics, should allow to offer them feedback and learning tasks that on the one hand fit their profile, but also contribute to further build it. Exactly that mechanism involves a kind of learning that threatens to lock up students in their profile, in their past, in their world. It makes, in fact, their past defining their future, defining what they are going to encounter, which seems to be more and more themselves and their own personalized world. Moreover, through all the digital means, what students do or not do in education becomes increasingly visible, so that its defining force becomes very strong, and the practices of sharing, the practice of exercise and trying changes. These practices become more and more dependent of social recognition, and so threaten the possibility to find a worldly and not a social measure outside oneself. They threaten the possibility for attentive work that finds its measure in the matter one is dealing with and not in social recognition and feedback, or at least not alone. And so we have to ask, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, so we have to ask whether the way in which the digital is actually shaping the present of education is not depriving youngsters of the time space of pedagogical freedom, pedagogical equality, and of the disclosing and belonging to a shared or common world. Is the right to education not to be specified maybe beyond the right to access to digital means into the right to school? Can we maybe already imagine new practices with the digital that generate free time, that interrupt the defining forces of the past and of the social background, that protect against forces of the market, that embody and speak a scholastic language, a language that is inviting and seducing, which is saying try and not saying do this, and if this, then do that. New practices that make us belong to a shared world and not locked up in our world. The digital allows an access to knowledge and skills to be connected to others and other worlds to an extent which never existed before. But we think that the appeal to school that accompanies the pandemic results from the awareness, especially expressed by youngsters, of what we appreciate so much about school. Hence, the question is how the digital can contribute to reimagining and reinvention of the school as a space-time that realizes pedagogical freedom and equality and can remain a place for the undefined work of freedom, or what Comenius, one of the fathers of modern education, calls a workplace of humanity. So that is what I wanted to present you. I apologize that I'm a little bit longer than I thought I would be.
Okay, thank you, Jan. We're bringing Ana Paula here to help me. And just while Lynn gets prepared for his talk, I would just like to mention, because as you were talking to us, 3 points from your talk. The first one, the world could start to speak to the students when the engine on the table. The second point about the transmission, and this idea of transmission equals reproduction. And the third one, the pedagogical art of speech. For me, all of these 3 points, they are really, really connected to Paulo Freire's ideas. All of them, from the critical pedagogy to the contextualization that Freire says. You cannot step into a classroom without knowing your students, and allow students to know the world, but also the world to speak to them. So these were 3 points that caught my attention, and it reminded me of Paulo Freire all the time from your talk. Anna, would you like to help me?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think this is a wonderful talk in times of pandemic, as it helps us understand pretty much the reality that we are living, the different realities that we are living, and also coming up and finding ways to think together and try to change the terms of the conversation. Your call in particular towards this notion of school as space-time, as pedagogical freedom and equality in times when we are seeing the lack of freedom and the lack of equality, especially in Brazil, is a necessary, a fundamental talk. In times when I hear you say, and I couldn't agree more, when you say this notion of just trying, and I at the same time see that teachers themselves are not finding the ways to try either as they are juggling with online and face-to-face teaching practices. So probably the chat will bring lots of questions that we could get back and explore more after Lynn's talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. So I'm bringing, Michelle, can we bring Lynn right now? And Anna, thank you very much. Hi, Lynn. And so I will just introduce Lynn very fastly. And I will also ask Michelle to to be prepared with the slides, with the Lynn slides. So let's go. Thank you, Lynn. Professor Lynn Mario Menezes Souza is Professor of Language Education at the University of São Paulo, Brazil. He also works within and outside the boundaries of applied linguistics and literature. That's me, okay, Lynn, describing you. His research interests lie in language policy and politics, literacies, teacher education, language education, intercultural studies, indigenous knowledges and cosmologies, and decolonial theories. Professor Lynn Mario has widely published on a range of topics, articles, books, and book chapters in relation to language, literacy, and indigenous education in Brazil and other southern contexts. One of his recent publications is this book, Glocal Languages and Critical Intercultural Awareness, The South Answers Back, from Routledge 2019. And he is one of the coordinators, together with Professor Valkyria Montemor. I have just seen one of her questions in the chat. Thank you, Valkyria, for being with us. So Valkyria and Professor Lynn Mario Menezes Souza, they coordinate a national-wide project, the one that I mentioned right in the beginning of my introduction, the National Project of Literacies, which is formed by 35 public and private universities in Brazil, and also counts with the collaboration of international scholars. So, Lynn Mario, thank you very much for being with us. And again, it's going to be a pleasure and an honor to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle, for that introduction. And thank you, Jan, for that wonderful presentation. Curiously, the last time we spoke together in the same session, it was in a session in Italy on what I call crystal balling, where we were asked to think about education or professions for the future. Now here, it's interesting that you should refer to the time-space equation, because that is something that I'm also going to refer to, but in a different sense. So my focus is not on education in general, but on teachers and teachers as subjects of learning. And where I'd like to situate myself is, first, I'm speaking from São Paulo. I'm speaking from a scenario of more than 400,000 deaths due to the pandemic, deaths which are due to largely the absence of policies. So education is our present status, or the present status of our education is just one more lack of adequate policies. All we can do is hope that it's not going to be as fatal and lethal as our lack of health policies and vaccinations. Okay, so one of the things that I want to begin with is Jan mentioned Hannah Arendt, and one of Hannah Arendt's concepts of on education and culture, and she says we're always born in her concept of natality, we're always born as latecomers to culture and society. So culture and society is always already in existence, and we are born into it as latecomers. What I'm my take on the pandemic in relation to teachers is this. The pandemic occurred. We as teachers came to it as latecomers. So it was there. We didn't have time to prepare for it. So yes, I will be avoiding referring to Freire, except in a few cases here, because I'm not sure to what extent Freire can be helpful to us in this particular moment. But certainly when Freire talks about education for changing the world by changing how we think about the world, and not the world as something abstract, but through concrete material practices, this brings back our traditional view, and I say by traditional I mean our modernistic view, because I'm also speaking from the perspective of decolonial theory and epistemologies of the South. That is a perspective critical of Eurocentric postmodernity and its concepts of time as being progressive and linear, and its concept of knowledge as being, and science as being unique to Eurocentrism. So this is where we have inherited our concepts of education from. They are all modern in this sense. And what they are constantly telling us is that education contributes to changing the world in whatever context. And this is what motivates us as teachers to dedicate ourselves to education. And here, I just remember, I'd like to remind people of one of the last doctoral thesis defenses I was at, which is Professor Valkyria's student, Nella Gley Marx, who she did the research on how teachers are still willing to become teachers in spite of lack of adequate policies, lack of adequate payment, lack of available courses for teachers to face their everyday situations. In spite of all of this, teachers are still willing to become teachers. So it's this idea of change which we find very motivating. Now, what happens when we stop thinking of change in linear terms? So we prepare ourselves, or someone prepares us, and we prepare our students to change the world. But what happens when a change occurs, such as the pandemic? A drastic change occurs, which we have never been prepared for. What happens then? This is what is questioning our basic assumptions of education as preparation for social change. We have had a social change occurring for which we have not been prepared. Right? And yet, we have a rupture in the linearity of our time in terms of education, that first we have to prepare and then we put it into practice. This is the modernistic idea. We go from theory to practice. This linearity has been broken. Suddenly our teachers, all of us who are teaching, have been thrown into a situation for which we have not been prepared. Okay, it's digital, but we haven't been prepared to deal with the digital to the extent that we are dealing with at the moment. So we've been thrown into a situation which, if we stop to think, it is forcing us to question. And Jan raised some of the points of when he spoke of digital education. We're being forced to question our views of education in general. So, and yet we speak of things like the new normal. What new normal? Normal for whom, right? So we come back to these modernistic theories of progress and evolution and development. Normality is constantly looking towards the future, believing in progress. And what happens when we haven't been prepared? This is what we are living, the situation we are living in at the moment. And what I'd like to point to is how, as you will see in a moment, how we haven't been prepared to think of this. Okay, the next slide, please. And here we have a little cartoon which just to show how you may not sure to what extent you can all see it, how teachers are victimized at the moment. We're always being seen as invisible, irrelevant, and not really doing anything significant. And here you can see where they say that even people like the policemen, bus drivers are working, the teacher isn't. And then you have in the second picture the teacher doing several things at the same time. And here I emphasize the fact that the teacher is female, a mother, looking after her kids, cooking, ironing, and at the same time teaching online. Now, what has she been prepared for? Right? If her culture has prepared her for being a mother and a wife in a certain way, certainly her education has not prepared her to deal with this kind of situation that she is dealing with at the moment. The next slide, please. So that's where my point of beginning is teachers as victims. But I don't want to, I'm focusing on teachers as victims, not to victimize teachers or to show teachers in a negative light, but to do exactly the opposite, to recuperate the agency of teachers in spite of being victims. So what I'm doing is I'm focusing on two pieces of research which are available online. I'm not going to go into the quality of this research, or they're both done by private institutions, Instituto Peninsula and Nova Escola, but they are data available to us, and this is what I'm taking into account, and I'm reading this data in positive terms rather than in negative, victimizing terms. Now, there are two ways of looking at the problem of teachers as victims of the pandemic. One is through critique, the critique that we have learned from our modern Eurocentric social sciences, which teaches us, nearly all of us in social sciences and the arts have had an education in social critique from a left point of view, if not from a Marxist point of view. And so we have been taught that critique or hermeneutics of suspicion means that we have to look at things beyond their appearances. And from the Foucaultian perspective, or looking for a genealogy of underlying causes. But the causes are always underlying, they are never apparent. So this gives us a time-space equation, which is very important here. It's the surface is not the same as the depth. We have to go beyond the surface to find the depth. But it also teaches us other things, which are not only that the depth is more important than the surface, it also teaches us, or we have learned from it, other aspects such as other non-linear hierarchical aspects, such as expert knowledge is more important than what Boaventura de Souza Santos calls artisanal knowledge, the learning from experience. Here I can say why I will not be referring to Freire, because Freire makes a distinction from a modernistic perspective between what he calls experiential or common sense knowledge and what he calls rigorous scientific learning, right? Which is, again, an appeal to the modernistic concept of science. So we make these distinctions through our acquisition of the values of modernity. We have learned these hierarchical distinctions between the depth is more important than the surface, expert knowledge is more important than commonsensical knowledge. So that's one way that we do critique. So when I say that expert knowledge is more important than commonsensical knowledge, what I'm saying is that we learn from those who know, right? So there are those who know, that's us academics, specialists, researchers, and those who don't know, the teacher in the classroom. The teacher in the classroom has to learn from us, And this is why we have teacher education. So we have this hierarchy between we know, they don't know. Here is a knowledge which has more value, that is the knowledge which has less value. Okay, now there's another way of looking at the problem. And here I'm looking at Jacques Rancière's idea of verification. Not critique, but what he calls verification. And what verification is the checking of the principle of equality, and checking if this principle of equality has been denied or not. What is the principle of equality? Those of you who are familiar with this know that principle of equality is to presuppose that we are all equal. Not that one day we will become equal. Because one day we will become equal, which is the presupposition of, number one, of critique. Because once we learn, we will become equal. Once we submit ourselves to expert knowledge, we will become equal. Once we know how we are being manipulated by hidden motivations and hidden ideologies, we will become equal, or we will be emancipated. Rancière looks at emancipation as something happening from the very beginning, at the principle of equality. So verification is presupposing from the beginning that we are all equal, and looking at our practices and seeing how does this occur in reality. So it does not make a distinction between surface and depth. It looks at social phenomena occurring and looking at what is happening there. That's verification. So two ways of critique, one modernistic and one questioning the standard concept of the modern. Next slide, please. So the idea of critique, a modernistic idea of critique, which focuses on either genealogy, looking at the origins of our present situation or the causes of our present situation, or looking at suspicion, how the real motives are underlying what seems to be what appears on the surface. This is a dichotomy of the visible and the invisible. The surface needs to be distrusted. Reality is always below the surface. So teachers as victims, we can see, just to give a quick example of what this kind of critique, modernistic critique, will do. And we have done this. We will say that teachers are victims at the moment, because this reveals the contemporary doxa or paradigm of the neoliberal precarization of labor regulations, the neoliberal devaluing of science, of education and knowledge, just looking at these as non-profitable activities. It reveals a concept of education as a product to be transmitted and received, and teachers as mere intermediaries. So this is what happens. It reveals what is underlying. Next slide, please. Just examples of how Freire uses this, even in something which I think promises a lot in his Pedagogy of Hope. Here I'm referring to the English translation in '92. See how he's oriented by this modernistic concept of surface and depth. He says, this is an intrinsic part of any educational practice with the power to unmask the dominant lies. This is an adventure in unveiling. I unveiled the problem by clearly and lucidly grasping its why. I dug up the archaeology by unraveling the fabric in which the facts are given to discovering their why. This paradigm of surface and depth predominates, and with it, without thinking about how with it comes the modernistic paradigm of hegemony and hierarchy of expert knowledge versus common sense knowledge. Next slide, please. Now, Rancière, on the other hand, makes a critique of critique, especially in his work, The Emancipated Spectator. And he shows how critique is inherited from a Marxist tradition of underlying or manipulative ideologies that need to be exposed and transformed in order to emancipate. Now, what does this mean? If in order to emancipate, we have to show people how they are being manipulated and exploited, then we are saying that we know and they don't, right? We are establishing a hierarchy of knowledge. We have expert knowledge. We know that exploitation and manipulation exist, but the general people don't. Liberal capitalism, says Rancière, uses the same underlying manipulative mechanism to hide its strategies of exploitation as beneficial to all. So what happens, according to Rancière's critique of critique, says our critique, which we have learned from the modernistic left, our critique reproduces the logic of depth and surface without changing it. Because we continue to say, look, now we have changed it, right? But be careful, because the real meaning is still behind what appears on the surface. Now, this logic of depth and surface, Rancière says, has been co-opted by the hegemonic capitalist users of it. It leads to frustrated indignation and impotence on the part of us, the informed critics of the left. And we are left with the feeling of there's no way out. Whereas the dominant capitalist hegemony benefits from our feeling of incompetence by saying that, look, we allow everybody to have their say. We allow these people to be critical. They can have all their critical journals and their critical books, and they can be critical of the system. So don't tell us we are being manipulative. We are allowing you to say what you like, but in the end, because we know that we're using the same logic and nothing will change. On the surface, it looks like we are permitting critique, but using the same idea of the surface and depth, everything continues as always. And emancipation is always deferred. Next slide, please. So what is, sorry, the next slide is, can we go to slide number 18? Okay, thank you. So here again, making a critique of modernist science and modernist social sciences especially, Boaventura Souza Santos points towards a discrepancy between experience and expectations. So there's a contemporary discrepancy between current negative experience and hope for emancipation. We have modern problems for which we do not have modern solutions, indicating a discrepancy between theory and practice. He says we need to go beyond our critical theories, our modernist critical theories. We have become too dependent on our modern critical theories. We are caught between the violence of coercion, which is the violence of capitalist coercion, and the violence of assimilation and adaptation, which is that experience that I just mentioned in the previous slide of there's little we can do. We do our critiques, but nothing actually changes, nothing actually happens. This is the violence of assimilation and adaptation. All we can do is adapt. And he says we need a new epistemological reflection, as the comprehension of our world is greater than the Western comprehension of the world. So we need to go beyond our inheritance of our Western theories of critique. Our social theories, he says, reproduce the colonial division of labor between the powerful, those that know and those that don't. Next slide, please, 18. Slide 18, please. Sorry, slide 17. Sorry, going upwards. Okay, so what are the, continuing on his critique of our social thinking, Boaventura says that we have been accustomed in our modernist thinking to lazy thinking. Our critique has taught us a lazy form of thinking. And lazy thinking is a thinking that sees itself as the only way of thinking and doesn't make the effort to see and think the wealth of different forms of thinking, and doesn't make the effort to see its categories of thinking as reductive. So it doesn't question its own categories of thinking. And this lazy thinking takes two forms, one which he calls metonymic reasoning and the other proleptic reasoning. Metonymic reasoning is simply the idea where the part is taken as the whole, or the Western form of reasoning and reality is seen as everybody's form of reality. So one particular form of thinking is seen as the only possible, is universalized as the only possible form of thinking. It focuses on the future as progression and development and ignores and contracts the wealth of the present. By focusing on the future, we remove our attention from the present. So the multiplicity that exists in the present, the complexity of the present, is subjugated to the call of the future. And this is how the experience, the complexity of the present is wasted. The other aspect of lazy thinking is proleptic reasoning, which sees the future as already existing and unknown, where our utopia is here and now, and it's what orients us. Utopia is not something we have to fight for. We believe in it as something existent, as something real. It expands the future infinitely. So if we are already in the future, and the future begins now and expands to whatever whatever other we can think of as the future, what have we lost? The wealth of the present, the complexity of the present moment. Our focus on the present becomes invisible. So he says, what can we do? We need to expand the present and learn from the wealth of experiences that we ignore. And we need to contract the future as not something already known, but as something we need to prepare for. So the future is something we need to prepare for. We have to actively invest in preparing for. Can we go back to slide number 7, please? I'm just giving you an experience in non-linear, non-modern thinking here by jumping from one slide to another. Okay, so what is Rancière's proposal of critique as verification? It presupposes the principle of equality. And what is the principle of equality? As all men are equal at the point of departure of analysis. The problem lies not in surface depth, appearance, reality, but in the distribution of the sensible. Rancière's idea of the distribution of the sensible is the unequal distribution of the categories which establish things like normality, what is knowledge, what is art, what is ethics, what is politics, etc., etc. So all our categories, all our concepts of what is capacity, what is not capacity, what is affect, what is not affect, all of these are distributed in a particular way by modernity, in a particular hierarchical way by modernity. And it is this distribution which needs to be challenged. And for Rancière, politics is the challenging, the constant questioning of an established form of distribution. This distribution occurs at the surface and can be verified. We can see it happening just by looking at what people are doing, how they're doing it, who they are. The distribution of the sensible stems from the coexistence of conflicting histories which erupt into the space of a collectivity. So we have socially, we have conflicting histories, we have differences. Right? So when we learn from modernity that critique is this or that, that progress is this or that, science is this or that, development is this or that, we are learning one particular form of thinking, one particular form of categories and capacities. Politics involves a rearticulation of a distribution of the sensible, a distribution of these categories and capacities, a challenging of established categories by the excluded or uncounted for elements. So those of us who have not been included into the dominant distribution of the sensible, Rancière uses the expression, we are the uncounted because we were not counted by those who count. And those who count, this is ambiguous, it means Not only those who can tell you if you can count, if you are important, if you have value or not, but those who have the power of saying you exist and you don't exist. You are visible and you're not visible. Right? So those who have been excluded by this hierarchy, established hierarchy or hegemony, are those who have no part. But the fact that they have no part in the established hierarchy or the established hegemony does not mean that they do not exist. They may be not visible like our teachers at the moment, but they certainly exist. They are there, right? And they are there to challenge those who consider them to be invisible. So Rancière says, whether this uncounted part, let's say the invisible teachers, exists in the political issue, is the political issue, and it is the object of political litigation. Political struggle is not a conflict between well-defined interest groups. It is an opposition of logics that count the parties and parts of the community in different ways. Verification is the form of critique that checks on how distribution occurs in a particular group or in a particular event. Next slide, please. So let's have a look now. What are we checking on? The teacher's capacity to resist victimhood during the pandemic. Next, please. And here I come, now I look at some of the data of the research. Now I'm taking the data of the research. I'm not going to look at this data in depth. I'm taking the data that I'm interested in, which is the data that shows the victims, the teachers, not as victims, but as productive, active subjects. So the Nova Scholar research is called The Situation of Teachers in Brazil During the Pandemic. It was research done in May 2020, last year. It involved 9,557 respondents, 85% in basic education. Of this 85%, 53% were from the Southeast, where the majority of the population of the country is. 75% were public schools, and 17% of the teachers investigated actually taught live in private, and these were private school teachers. 85%, this is not surprising, but extremely important for us in our concept of the distribution of the sensible in relation to teachers. 85% of women teachers were 85% of these teachers were women teachers dealing simultaneously with teaching students remotely and running their families and homes. 85% of these teachers. In spite of this, only 19.6% rated their emotional health as 5 out of 10. What would we expect from these 85% of teachers dealing with the complexity of being mothers, housewives, teaching remotely, hybridly, using all kinds of digital means, and without being prepared for this? We would expect something much worse than 19.6%. Next slide, please. The teacher assessment of remote teaching. Now, this is, again, the data from this research. Now, what I want to emphasize is on the results on the left-hand column. So in spite of this, the difficulties, and the difficulties are on the right, 60% of these teachers gave a positive rating to remote teaching. Only 30% said it was bad. They had difficulty with the medium, they had low student response, they were pressed for results, they had a high demand from families for individual attention, from the student families for individual attention, and also from these were teachers who are also mothers, responding to pressure of demands of individual attention from their own children as learners. A lack of knowledge, infrastructure, and direct contact with students. These were the bad things of this. Now, what's amazing is that 60% responded positively. And this is divided as 27% actually said they found remote teaching good, and 33% found it reasonable. Now, what did they show as positive aspects of remote digital teaching? An opportunity for new learning, progression in dealing with hybrid pedagogy, so they learned how to deal with digital methodologies, the possibility of reinventing oneself professionally, and here is the most important aspect, the possibility of reinventing oneself professionally. They are conscious of the fact that they were reinventing themselves. So in other words, they are conscious of the fact that they had not lost out. They were not victims suffering from deficit and deficiency. They were gaining something by reinventing themselves professionally. There was a strong element of creativity involved. They pointed to good feedback from the students, and another positive aspect was flexible schedules. For those who were, this was important for those who were the 85% who were women, mothers, and wives. Next slide, please. Another aspect here, which I think is positive, and in my reading, the teacher use of materials, the capacity of self-help of these teachers. So only 30% of the teachers stuck to official textbooks. Only 30%. 59% used the materials prepared by school services, which pointed to not only the textbooks, but also available materials online or prepared materials which the schools or the school system, the official school system offered. 39% used suggestions from other teachers. So here we can see especially how significant learning from colleagues and friends was. 38% used the internet as a source of information and materials. Now you might say, what about the other 65% in this data? What I'm interested in here is not data that will bring me universality and say what everybody looks like, because then, and what is happening to everybody. I'm not interested in establishing a new normal. I'm not interested in going back to modernistic critique, which says this is how people should behave and this is what everybody should do. The idea of the experts and the non-experts. Here what we can see is that in general, at least 40% are capable of learning on their own. So what is this? What kind of learning is this? Next slide, please. Before I consider what kind of learning is this, this is the other research done by the Institute of Peninsula, and it focuses on teacher feelings. So it looks at the effective aspects of teachers during March 2020 and November 2020. Here they don't give you data on how many people they use. They say they were not interested in numbers, though it was a quantitative piece of research. They did what they call representative sampling. So random representative sampling throughout the country. So there was not a focus on the Southeast. This was done throughout the country. Now, what do we find in March 2020? 88% of teachers never taught remotely. And in 2020, 72% continue to teach remotely. What are the main preoccupations in March 2020? Teachers are worried about mental health, their own and their families, and the mental health of students. Teachers feel unprepared for remote teaching. They are worried and anxious. They feel insecure. They don't know how to deal with the situation. They haven't learned, they haven't been prepared, no one has taught them. They focus on the care for the self, the family, and students. It is the beginning of the pandemic. We don't know what's happening to us. We don't know what kind of virus is this. So the focus is on taking care. The focus is on the need to share relevant information of the pandemic. So they are trying to educate their students, not only in terms of the curriculum, but also trying to give them information, relevant and real information in relation to the pandemic. Here in Brazil, we know this goes against what our government was giving us. The focus on the need to adapt routines. So this was a problem. What am I going to do? I'm teaching from home, and how am I going to adapt my routine? Now, if we come, the same research was compared with November 2020. 72% continue to teach remotely. What happens now? They begin to see technology as an ally. It is no longer the source of anxiety. It is an ally. They continue to be worried about the mental health, but not their own, now of their students. A little bit like what Jan was referring to in digital education. They feel less anxious. 44% see the future of education lying on the path of hybrid teaching. So suddenly, what do we see here? We could say, okay, in neoliberal terms, in modernistic terms, this is the coercion of adaptation. We can't resist, so we adapt. That's one way of looking at it. Or we have been forced to adapt. But in order to consider this adaptation, we should have had some kind of conception of how we should behave. We should have been prepared to act in a particular way as teachers teaching remotely. We weren't. So it's not a question of adapting to a particular model. It is a question of something which Boaventura de Souza Santos calls artisanal knowledge. And what is artisanal knowledge? Artisanal knowledge for Boaventura is the knowledge which our modern sciences and modern social sciences simply ignored. Artisanal knowledge is the knowledge of the artisan. Now, what is the knowledge of the artisan? It is not the knowledge of imitation and reproduction, because the artisan can never produce two objects in exactly the same way. So it's a kind of dialogue between thinking you're reproducing, but actually creating. Right? So it's not mere reproduction, it's creativity following a pre-established pattern. Another important aspect of artisanal knowledge, which Boaventura emphasizes, is that artisanal knowledge is something which is gained and developed, and this is extremely important here, not in a school or in a classroom isolated from the world, but in the middle of the world. It's a knowledge that we develop at the same time as we're doing other things that we have to do in our daily lives. So it's this knowledge that is appearing in amongst our teachers. Next slide, please. So just to bring together now, what I want to show is how our teachers have developed this artisanal knowledge. They have learned. They have not simply adapted. They have learned, or our expression, se viraram, right? They have learned bottom up, which goes against the modernistic social scientific concept of top down. We learn from the experts. We learn from those who know. They have had to learn from practice, by themselves, or as we saw, from their colleagues and other teachers. They have found a way of learning. So here I'm just summarizing now the positive aspects that I see in the data of these two researchers. 85% are women teachers, so they should be people who are incapable of learning because they have little time. They're dealing with their families, with their children, and at the same time have to prepare their classes and deal with a medium of instruction for which they were not prepared. 39% use suggestions from other teachers. These are, I've referred to these before. I'm just gathering all of the positive data on the same slide. 38% use the internet as a source of information. So this is their own research. 72% continue to teach remotely. They perceive technology as an ally. They feel less anxious about the pandemic and teaching remotely. 44% see the future of education lying on the path of hybrid teaching. This is learning which has occurred. This is the victims resisting, but not resisting passively, resisting actively, transforming their marginalization, let's say, into their invisibility into agentivity. Next slide, please. So the teachers have been exploited, overworked, but resistant. The teacher agency becomes clear in the research. Women teachers, as a majority facing pressures from family and profession, persist. The attainment of familiarity of using technology and looking for materials and support online and from other teachers. Technology has moved from an obstacle to an ally. Teacher learning can be explained through Rancière's universal concept of universal teaching, rather than on a modernistic, progressive, linear model of teachers waiting to be trained and emancipated at a later date. Next slide, please. Now, what is this concept of universal teaching by Rancière, which is he develops basically in his The Ignorant Schoolmaster? I talked about the principle of the logic of equality. This logic of equality is a point of departure and not a point of arrival. As a point of departure, it believes that equality exists at the present moment. It is not something that is to be attained. The same intelligence, it's an equality of intelligence. He says the same intelligence is at work in all acts of the human mind. So we are all capable of learning. We all have the intelligence to learn. All men have equal intelligence. Please excuse the male-centric use of men. In opposition to the logic of equality, we have the logic of inequality, which is the modernistic conception. Inequality is what exists at the moment, so we are unequal. We have an unequal distribution of things, and equality is to be attained in the future. So I don't have the knowledge that I need, but I will develop this knowledge in the future. Universal teaching breaks with the logic of inequality. It is what all the emancipated can do. All those who have decided to think of themselves as people just like everyone else. So I don't think of myself as a victim. I've been left on the wayside by those who should have taught me, those who should have prepared me. No, I see myself as emancipated and capable of making decisions and learning. So we all have equal intelligence, but one thing that Rancière points to is that our will for learning is not distributed equally. And what we need to do, perhaps in a pedagogic concept, is stimulate the will to learn, or what Freire contributes to by telling us about the importance of curiosity in learning. Next slide, please. This is how Rancière sees the importance of will. So we all have the same capacity of intelligence and learning, but we don't all have the same degree of development of our wills. So he says this: speech is filled or emptied of meaning depending on whether the will compels or relaxes the workings of the intelligence. So we need the will to stimulate the working of the intelligence. Meaning is the work of the will. This is the secret of universal teaching, the relentless work to bend the body to necessary habits, to compel the intelligence to new ideas, to new ways of expressing them, to redo on purpose what chance once produced. So if we've learned something by chance, which we are also capable of doing, how can we recuperate that learning by chance, which has proved that we are capable of learning, to do it more consciously, to reverse unhappy circumstances into occasions for success? This is what our teachers have been doing, reversing unhappy circumstances into occasions for success. Teachers have been capable of producing intellectual acts. Next slide, please. Sorry, next, jump the next two, please. Yeah, jump the next one. Yeah, so now I'm reaching the end, I promise. Just to end with this, and here to recuperate something that I mentioned that Freire talks about a lot, without necessarily citing Freire, because I still need to look into this, but I'm not comfortable with Freire's concept of epistemology, with the fact that does Freire consider epistemology to be something like rigorous scientific thinking, right? Or not? Because epistemology is learning, but what exactly what kind of epistemology is Freire giving value to? Because he already made a distinction between two kinds of learning. Now, Ernst Bloch refers to fear and hope, and here I'm using Bloch to move from the data of March 2020 to December. So we had insecurity, fear, the fear of mental health of teachers in March, to a hope. Now, digitality is an ally in December. Bloch sees fear as passive, incapacitating action, and hope as open to new possibilities. So fear freezes us, it doesn't allow us to move, whereas hope can bring agentivity, but not just any hope. He's very clear in what he considers to be positive hope. For him, as life is never static, but always a process of becoming, in order to avoid hope as something passive, referring to pleasurable images to be passively received, as if in a daydream of a pleasurable future, hope has to be learned for Bloch. One needs to actively and rationally think through the pleasurable images of hope. One needs to grasp the new, which comes with hope. We need to grasp the new as something that is mediated in what exists and is in motion. So we can only arrive at the new if we move, if we deal with what already exists. Whoops, I've lost my slides.
Something happened to Michelle. She went off. Just a second, Lynn. It's the last slide, right?
Yeah. It's okay. I don't need it. I can come to an end without the slide. So basically, what Bloch is saying is we need to think actively and rationally through the pleasurable images of hope. So hope brings us a point, an image of where we'd like to be, and we have to work through the present to get to this image of where we'd like to be. So hope is not a utopia which we think we will get to anyway. Hope is something to be, although it is something to be revealed, he says, the new demands the most extreme effort of will. So hope needs the will. Hope, in order to go beyond something passive, requires active thinking. But how what exists can be transformed into something new. This can be learned by thinking about the present. And this is here, it's important. Bloch says we can learn by hope by thinking about the present as if from the future. By starting, what does this mean? It means by starting from the pleasurable image of the future one hopes for. And from this, we start to actively transform the present. So how do teachers do this? How have they done it? Probably, right? they know what teaching involves because they have all had experience, but they don't know what teaching during the pandemic remotely involved. So what they established, they learned that to establish, and they all had an image of what learning involves in an abstract sense. And they began from that. It was that abstract sense, the hope of what learning involves, that oriented their actions in the present and made them this 40% or 60% come to the end of 2020 by looking at with a positive reaction to remote learning. So the teachers are victims, yes, but capable victims, capable of change in a non-modernistic sense, bottom up, and in spite of expert teaching. Thank you.
Okay, let me stop sharing. Anna?
Lynn, there would be hundreds, millions, thousands of things to be talked after your brilliant talk. But then since we're running out of time, I would say that, yeah, we're living at a different situation if we compare this year with last year, as this notion of capable victims for teachers is quite necessary to be called. It is hopeful. The talk that you bring about hope is itself hopeful. And I think that this artisanal knowledge happening among teachers, as you raised, that has to be valued, has to be acknowledged, somehow happens also among children, among students who now are also reframing and reimagining what is happening online as classrooms, not in the discourse, not within a discourse of adaptation, but a discourse of resistance. That goes hand in hand with this notion of performance epistemology that we've been talking about, or the Brazilian notion of gambiarra by Joe Windows and others. But we have to acknowledge that those technologies are being used, and there is a good use. But as a teacher educator, I've been questioning a lot of how much we still lack a new pedagogical language. So, and this is something that I've been learning from my recent readings from Jan Masschelein, how much we have to once again talk about a pedagogical language with those teachers, in the sense that we could strengthen this agency that started from technology, but in pedagogical terms needs to be once again put under scrutiny. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't want to use much of the time to explain myself, but this is something that I've been thinking a lot, and I don't know if it makes sense to you. Thank you so much for these two talks, Jan and Lynn.
Mm-hmm. So I have a suggestion, actually. We have 7 minutes. But anyways, but first of all, I'd like to, my first suggestion is that if Jan and Lynn agrees, we have hundreds of questions from the chat. Maybe if our team could help us put them together and send to you guys. Of course, many of the questions, they have been answered, but also the parallel talk of the chat is really something very, very interesting. So maybe I would suggest that the 4 of us could finish by maybe wrapping up the conversation. And there were many questions for Jan, thinking about this idea of the just try. It was very, very commented in the chat. This idea of the just try in teacher education. There were many questions for Lynn about the, also again, the connection to what we've been, all of this philosophical talk in connection to teacher education, the artisan knowledge for you to, how to overcome that. Well, many questions and comments, but I don't know, maybe I would invite Lynn and Jan for some more comments on both of your talks, and then Anna and I can jump in.
Can I just try to connect both talks? Because as
Yes.
lots of people were watching on live and were asking about this notion of just try it. As we, at the same time, we acknowledge that many teachers have tried indeed. Some of them are trying with regards to the uses of technology and ways of dealing, ways with coping with this online teaching. But as they try, they are sometimes also in the got into the traps of not being able to put their own kids and students in this just trying perspective. So there are pressures, there are especially neoliberal driving forces operating behind the scenes as the online opens up for a new kind of panoptic. So as they themselves are trying, they're probably trying with regards to the technical stuff, but with regards to the pedagogical stuff and in relation to what schools are for, that is towards the liberation and the freedom for students, how could they try being pressured by so many driving forces?
Yeah, and so I can maybe just add so that I agree with Anna. So I think there's a lot of that can be connected between the two, between what we said, and so especially I think also this notion of the try, in a way you could say that this is a kind of materialization of what Lynn referred to with to Rancière, saying that it is so starting from the assumption of equality. In a certain sense, that is I say trying is kind say try is assuming the equality, is saying you are able. You can always start with something. So Rancière is referring to many examples in his book of okay, there is always some, you can always, you know already something, and you can always connect something to that something, and so you can start. That's it. So try. So it's not, so in a way it is a kind of, I think it's very close in that sense. Maybe I can just say one thing, is that I think that precisely, and in a certain sense it refers to this, let's say, this creativity, if we can call it like this, of teachers today, that maybe rather than have a, or not rather, but that maybe teacher education should include something, or make important something like what I would like to call school studies. So how to make school, which is not completely the same for me as how to teach. So, but how to make school, and so using these, so and how to, and I think it cannot be without digital means today. So it has to be, you have to think about it. But precisely therefore, I think it's important to have a kind of what we would like to call a kind of touchstone. So something that you can also, are you actually making school, or are you doing something else? And so, and it's something like, I've said it many times, I think, not in this talk, but in many different occasions, that for me it's very close to the issue of democracy. So you could say that, of course, there are probably many ways in which we can think about democracy and what democracy is, and democracy is debated. And democracy is not the most efficient way to organize our lives. Probably it is much more efficient to do it in other ways. But it is maybe defendable because of the justice and the kind of freedom that nevertheless it promotes. So for me, the same is school. So if school is doing something, let's try and for me, it is about the kind of learning that is realizing a certain kind of equality and freedom. And in that sense, let us make school, even if it is not, and it certainly is not the most efficient and effective way of learning, but it is maybe the one that that realizes most freedom and equality, but we have to reinvent it, just as we have to reinvent also democracy, or are reinventing democracies in many ways today. So, but it is about a kind of reinvention with the means that we have, and so, and probably what Lynn was referring to is that this reinvention is not an issue of experts that are dealing with this question, but that it is a kind of common study practice and exercise practice that we have to develop. So in that sense, school studies could be something interesting to relate to teacher education, not just to fix on the teacher, but on school making. What is it about making school? It's just a comment.
If I may add to that, it's as I mentioned, the concept using Santos's concept of artisanal knowledge is one of the things he says about artisanal knowledge. It's not isolated in a classroom. It happens in media res, in the middle of things ongoing. So it doesn't separate. It doesn't have this disciplinary separation that modernity has taught us. That now we're in school, now we're not. Now we're doing history, now we're doing geography. So these things are happening around us at the same time as we are focused on something, and they will be influencing us whether we are conscious of it or not. So that creativity is not necessarily an intentional creativity. It's a creativity that will occur once our modernistic borders and boxes have been broken down, so we can have crossings of knowledge which will show us new ways of doing things, which women teachers have had to do by looking after their kids and teaching students online and housekeeping and whatever, all at the same time.
I think Anna just went off. I think she's trying to come back. Sadly, I'm going to have to finish because of time. But I'd like to invite you for something just as final words. What would you say to these? I know your presentations did that already, epistemologically speaking, lots of insights for the future teachers. But what would you say to these teachers, these language teachers that are watching us right now? And of course, the live will be showing again and again and again because it will be recorded as a final message. And then I will thank you. Wait for Ana Paula to come back. That's a difficult one. Yes, yeah.
Well, it's for me. Jan, you want to say something? I've just answered a question.
Go ahead.
No, I think it's for us as, let's say, language teachers or any teachers. Once we break down this idea of expert knowledge and non-expert knowledge, and we find our possibility of authoring our own knowledges, and it involves a different concept of authorship of knowledge. So here we can see in this data they're using their own experience, they're using textbooks, they're using material which has been prepared, teachers, information from their friends and colleagues who've done things already, similar things before, and accessing things online. So it's a different concept of to knowledge as something focused, linear, expert, and it's something we're not very accustomed to because, especially in language teaching, we have been threatened by so many of these modernist myths, beginning with the native speaker, secondly with the idea of correction, and language teaching has always been dominated by what is the best methodology, and all of these kind of these myths, they have diminished our belief in ourselves as authors.
Yeah, find it very difficult to say something as last words to to teachers. Also, because I think your situation is really also, well, of course, it is also very similar. It is also very similar, but there is also, I think, contexts which are rather different, also to a certain extent. And I think that Lynn already referred to this to the element of hope. I would say yes, it is still worthwhile to make school. So let's defend school, and let's try to make school with digital means, but not replace them, not replace school by digital learning environments. So that would be something that I could say, but it's very little. You took me by surprise. So it's not easy to have a kind of final word.
I'd like to compliment before we end, Jan and Lynn, that I think this is a moment for us to, especially in Brazil, and this is what I've been trying with this group, that we are doing all of this live, not only to promote all possible kinds of but also transdisciplinary knowledge. So what can we learn from others? Of course, we're still doing within the humanities. We're still doing this, but I'd like to invite activists and arts, and arts is humanities, but but I think this is something important for us to do now, to get this transdisciplinary knowledge from others in order to try to establish some kind of dialogue. But at the same time, I think that we from languages and then from human sciences, but also if we just talk about languages, we should unite more. We should dialogue within our differences, but we should unite more in relation to education, because things have been very, very tough. And I'm not saying that I should always agree with you or with what you research, but you research this, I research this, you teach like this, I teach like this, and all of this together maybe will bring some directions for us to move forward. Not talking about revolution, nothing like that, but I've been thinking about this a lot. Anna?
I am so sorry, I lost connection. So I'll have to watch your answers right after this moment. But thank you so much for these insightful, thought-provoking talks. Teachers are in need of talks like these, talks that bring and this importance of talking back about the role of schools in society, talks that place the teachers as agents capable for transforming and reinventing and reframing schools. So thank you very much. It was a very insightful moment. I learned from you a lot. And thank you, Daniel.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to thank Lynn and Jan and Lynn for this talk. I'd like to say to everybody that this is recorded, so please, if you want to watch it again, I always watch it again because I'm here in the backstage, desperate with everything, everything going on. But I always watch it really calmly later on. But thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Jan, for very insightful ideas. And our next event will be next week, May 14th, 3 p.m. Brasilia time. A autoetnografia na formação docente, espelhos, inovações, desnudando emoções. Well, let me see if I'm capable of translating this. Autoethnography in teacher education, mirrors, innovations. Guys, help me out.
Unpacking emotions.
Unpacking, thank you, Lynn. Unpacking emotions. Thank you very much for everybody who has been with us, and I hope you have a good evening back there in Brazil, and a good night here for us. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.